Maybe I'll just spend a moment on this internal-external pressure thing. My general experience with companies is that they can withstand most forms of external pressure as long as they retain internal coherence, right? So as long as the internal team is really bonded together and supporting each other, most forms of external pressure you can withstand. And by that, I mean investors dump your stock, you lose your biggest customers, whatever, negative article, negative headline. You can withstand all that, and basically, in fact, many of those forms of pressure can be bonding experiences for the team where they come out stronger. What you 100% cannot withstand is the internal crack. And what I always look for in high pressure corporate situations now is the moment when the internal team cracks, because I know the minute that happens, we're in a different regime. Like it's like the solid is turned into a liquid. Like we're in a different regime, and like the whole thing can unravel in the next week because then people turn it. I mean, this is what's happening in Los Angeles right now. The mayor and the fire chief turned on each other, and that's it. That government is dysfunctional. It is never going to get put back together again. It is over. It is not going to work ever again. And that's what happens inside companies. And so somebody like Marc is under like profound internal pressure and external pressure at the same time. Now, he's been very good at maintaining the coherence of his executive team, but he has had over the years a lot of activist employees, as a lot of these companies have had. And so that's been continuous pressure. And then the final thing I'd say is I said that companies can withstand most forms of external pressure, but not all. And the special, though not all one, is government pressure. Is that when your government comes for you, like, yeah, any CEO who thinks that they're bigger than their government has that notion beaten out of them in short order.
Can you just linger on that? Because it is maybe educating and deeply disturbing. You've spoken about it before, but worth speaking about again, this government pressure. So you think they've crossed the line into essentially criminal levels of pressure? Flagrant
criminality. Felonies, like obvious felonies. And I can actually cite the laws. But yes, absolute criminality.
Can you explain how those possible to happen, and maybe on a hopeful note, how we can avoid that happening again?
So to start with, is a lot of this now is in the public record, which is good because it needs to be in the public record. And so there's three forms of things that are in the public record that people can look at. So one is the Twitter files, right, which Elon put out with a set of journalists when he took over. And I will just tell you, the Twitter files are 100% representative of what I've seen at every other one of these companies. And so you can just see what happened in Twitter, and you can just assume that that happened in these other companies, for the most part, certainly in terms of the kind of pressure that they got. So that's number one. That stuff, you can just read it, and you should if you haven't. The second is, Marc referenced this in the Rogan podcast, there's a Congressman, Jim Jordan, who has a congressional committee called the Weaponization Committee. And they, in the last, 3 years, have done a full-scale investigation of this. And Facebook produced a lot of documents into that investigation. And many of those have now been made public. And you can download those reports. And there's like 2,000 pages worth of material on that. And that's essentially the Facebook version of the Twitter files, just arrived at with a different mechanism. And then third is Marc himself talking about this on Rogan. So I'll, just defer to his comments there. But yeah, basically what those three forms of information show you is basically the government, over time, and then culminating in 2020, 2021, in the last 4 years, just decided that the First Amendment didn't apply to them. And they just decided that federal laws around free speech and around conspiracies to take away the rights of citizens just don't apply. And they just decided that they can just arbitrarily pressure, just like literally arbitrarily call up companies and threaten and bully, and yell and scream and threaten repercussions and force them to censor. And there's this old thing of like, well, the First Amendment only applies to, the government. It doesn't apply to companies. It's like, well, there's actually a little bit of nuance to that. First of all, it definitely applies to the government. Like 100%, the First Amendment applies to the government. By the way, so does the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, including the right to due process, also applies to the government. There was no due process at all to any of the censorship regime that was put in place. There was no due process put in place, by the way, for debanking either. Those are just as serious violations as the free speech violations. And so this is just like flagrant unconstitutional behavior. And then there are specific federal statutes. It's 18241 and 18242. And one of them applies to federal employees, government employees, and the other one applies to private actors. around what's called deprivation of rights and conspiracy to deprive rights. And it is not legal, according to the United States Criminal Code, for government employees or in a conspiracy private entities to take away constitutional rights. And interestingly, some of those constitutional rights are enumerated, for example, in the First Amendment, freedom of speech. And then some of those rights actually do not need to be enumerated. If the government takes away rights that you have, they don't need to be specifically enumerated rights in the Constitution in order to still be a felony. The Constitution does not, very specifically, does not say you only have the rights that it gives you. It says you have all the rights that have not been previously defined as being taken away from you. Right. And so debanking qualifies as a right. Right to access to the financial system is every bit something that's subject to these laws as free speech. And so, this has happened. And then I'll just add one final thing, which is we've talked about two parties so far. We talked about the government employees, and then we've talked about the companies. The government employees, for sure, have misbehaved. The companies, there's a very interesting question there as to whether they are victims or perpetrators, or both. They will defend and they will argue, and I believe they have a good case that they are victims, not perpetrators, right? They are the downstream subjects of pressure, not the cause, not the cause of pressure. But there's a big swath of people who are in the middle, and specifically the ones that are funded by the government that I think are in possibly pretty big trouble. And that's all of these third-party censorship bureaus. The one that sort of is most obvious is the so-called Stanford Internet Observatory. That got booted up there over the last several years. And they basically were funded by the federal government to be third-party censorship operations. And they're private sector actors, but acting with federal funding. And so it puts them in this very interesting spot where there could be a very obvious theory under which they're basically acting as agents of the government. And so I think they're also very exposed on this and have behaved in just flagrantly illegal ways.
So fundamentally, government should not do any kind of pressure, even soft pressure, on companies to censor.
Can't. Not allowed.
It really is disturbing. I mean, it probably started soft, lightly, slowly, and then it escalates as the old will to power will instruct them to do. Because you get. That's why there's protection, because you can't put a check on power for government, right?
There are so many ways that they can get you. Like, there are so many ways they can come at you and get you. And, the thing here to think about is a lot of times when people think about government action, they think about legislation, right? Because when I was a kid, we got trained at how does government work. There was this famous animated short, the thing we got shown was just a cartoon of how a bill becomes a law. And it's like this, fancy little bill snicked along and goes this.
I'm just a bill. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, it's like, all right, number one, that's not how it works at all. Like that doesn't actually happen. We could talk about that. But even beyond that, mostly what we're dealing with is not legislation. When we talk about government power these days, mostly it's not legislation. Mostly it's either regulation, which is basically the equivalent of legislation, but having not gone through the legislative process, which is a very big open legal issue and one of the things that the DOJ is very focused on. Most government rules are not legislated; they're regulated, and there's tons and tons of regulations that these companies are sub. This is another cliche you'll hear a lot, which is, private companies can do whatever they want. And it's like, oh no, they can't. They're subject to tens of thousands of regulations that they have to comply with. And the hammer that comes down when you don't comply with regulations is profound. Like, they can completely wreck your company with no ability for you to do anything about it. So regulation is a big part of the way the power gets exercised. And then there's what's called just flat out administrative power, is the term that you'll hear. And administrative power is just literally the government calling you and telling you what to do. Here's an example of how this works. So Facebook had this whole program a few years back to do a global cryptocurrency for payments called Libra. And they built the entire system, and it was this high scale, sort of new cryptocurrency, and they were going to build it in every product, and there were going to be 3 billion people who could transact with Libra. And they went to the government, and they went to all these different, try to figure out how to make it so it's like fully compliant with anti-money laundering and all these, controls and everything. And they had the whole thing ready to go. 2 senators wrote letters to the big banks saying, we're not telling you that you can't work with Facebook on this, but if you do, you should know that every aspect of your business is going to come under greatly increased level of regulatory scrutiny, which is, of course, the exact equivalent of, it sure is a nice corner restaurant you have here. It would be a shame if, somebody tossed a Molotov cocktail through the window and burned it down tonight, right? And so that letter, like, what is that letter? Like, it's not a law. It's not even a regulation. It's just like straight, direct state power. And then it culminates in literally calls from the White House, where they're just like flat out telling you what to do, which is, of course, what a king gets to do, but not what a president gets to do. And so anyway, so what these companies experienced was they experienced the full panoply of this, but it was the level of intensity was in that order. It was actually legislation was the least important part. Regulation was more important. Administrative power was more important. And then just like flat out demands and flat out threats were ultimately the most important. How do you fix it? Well, first of all, like you have to elect people who don't do it. Right? So like, as with all these things, ultimately the fault lies with the voters. And so, you have to decide you don't want to live in that regime. I have no idea what part of this recent election mapped to the censorship regime. I do know a lot of people on the right got very angry about the censorship, but I think it probably at least helped with enthusiasm on that side. Maybe some people on the left will now not want their, Democratic nominees to be so pro-censorship. So the voters definitely, get a vote. Number one. Number two, I think you need transparency. You need to know what happened. We know some of what happened. Peter Thiel has written in the FT just now saying we just need like after what we've been through in the last decade, we need broad-based truth and reconciliation, efforts to really get to the root of things. So maybe that's part of it. We need investigations for sure. Ultimately, we need prosecutions. Like we need people to go to jail because we need to set object lessons that say that you don't get to do this. And on those last two, I would say that those are both up to the new administration, and I don't want to speak for them, and I don't want to predict what they're going to do, but they for sure have the ability to do both of those things, and we'll see where they take it.
Yeah, it's truly disturbing. I don't think anybody wants this kind of overreach of power for government, including perhaps people that were participating in it. It's like this dark momentum of power that you just get caught up in it, and that's the reason there's that kind of protection. Nobody wants that.
So I use the metaphor of the Ring of Power, and for people who don't catch the reference, that's Lord of the Rings. And the thing with the Ring of Power and Lord of the Rings, it's the ring that Gollum has in the beginning, and it turns you invisible, and it turns out it like unlocks all this like fearsome power. It's the most powerful thing in the world. It's the key to everything. And basically the moral lesson of Lord of the Rings, which was, written by a guy who thought very deeply about these things, is, the Ring of Power is inherently corrupting. The characters at one point, they're like, Gandalf, just put on the ring and like fix this. Right. And he's like, he will not put the ring on even to like end the war, because he knows that it will corrupt him. And then, the character, as it starts, the character of Gollum is the result of, it's like a normal character who ultimately becomes, this incredibly corrupt and deranged version of himself. And so, I mean, I think you said something actually quite profound there, which is the Ring of Power is infinitely tempting. The censorship machine is infinitely tempting. If you have it, like you are going to use it. It's overwhelmingly tempting because it's so powerful, and that it will corrupt you. And I don't know whether any of these people feel any of this today. They should. I don't know if they do. But you go out 5 or 10 years later, you would hope that you would realize that your soul has been corroded, and you probably started out thinking that you were a patriot and you were trying to defend democracy, and you ended up being, extremely authoritarian and anti-democratic and anti-Western.